This is the Canon R8, and this is the Canon R6 Mark II. If you click this video, it's probably because you're interested in one or both of these cameras, but specifically the differences between them. On paper, both of these cameras sound very similar. So should you spend the $600, $700, $800 more to upgrade from the R8 to the R6 Mark II, or are they effectively the same camera? Last week I brought the R8 and the R6 II with me to shoot an air show, which might seem counterintuitive given that I probably could have shot on the R5 or gotten something like the Canon R7, which is a crop sensor, and would have given me a little bit more telephoto reach. But the R8 is currently on loan to me from Canon, and so I've been wanting to shoot on it more and specifically compare it to the R6 II, which is a camera that I personally purchased and have owned since the day it was released. At first glance, both of these cameras are very similar. The specs sound the same. Canon actually advertises that the R8 uses the same sensor and internal processor as the R6 Mark II. And you might look at both of these cameras and go, well, really, the only difference is the size. But actually, it's not that straightforward. There are quite a few features that are in the R6 II that didn't make their way into the R8. But before we get into that, let's talk about the one thing these cameras do have in common, which is the sensor. So Canon advertises the R8 as the same 24 megapixel sensor, so 6,000 by 4,000 megapixels if you're shooting photos. And this is good news if you're someone who only cares about resolution and dynamic range. The R6 II and the R8 have the same. In fact, if you go online and you look out shutter readout speeds, you'll find that both of these sensors read out at the same speed, which is a good indicator that Canon is in fact telling the truth, that the sensor in both of these cameras is in fact the same. And a kind of fun fact is that both of these cameras actually have a faster sensor readout than the higher end Canon R5. Now, of course, that camera's a little bit older at this point and does have more resolution, more megapixels, so it's kind of an unfair comparison. But the big thing is that the R8 has no IBIS, or no in-body image stabilization. That means unlike the R6 II, which has IBIS, the sensor inside the R8 is fixed. It doesn't move. There are actually two big advantages to that. The first is that there's less internal requirements, that there's not as much space for all of those IBIS components. And so when you put these cameras side by side, you'll actually notice that the R8 is not only a lot thinner, but when you compare the other dimensions, it's a lot smaller. I'm not recommending you do this, but you can actually fit the R8 into your pocket. It's kind of dumb, but you can do it. The other advantage is that because there is no IBIS, you don't get those crazy corner jello IBIS wobbles, which if you've seen any of my vlog style videos where I'm holding my lens out like this and shooting at 15, 16 millimeters, you know that the corners tend to get a little bit crazy. So while I've found that the footage from the R8 doesn't have that for wide angle, when you switch to telephoto, that's when you start to notice the lack of IBIS, and that's where it becomes a disadvantage. The other disadvantage is that the R8 doesn't have a full mechanical shutter. It has a shutter, we'll talk about that in a bit, but the one thing you can't do with this camera is have the shutter down when the camera powers off. So if you grab an R6, you can see that on, there's the sensor, but if I turn it off, the shutter goes down. When the R8 is off, the sensor is just always exposed. There is no shutter, there is no cover, there is nothing that comes down to cover the sensor. So at a high level bird's eye view summary of the R8 is a good, if not great option for the price. Comparing everything else out there that's full frame, there basically are no other options. If you're looking for an entry-level full frame camera, this is what you wanna go with. I don't think it replaces the R6 II for some of the reasons that we'll talk about in a bit, but if you're someone who doesn't have the money for an R6 II, it's a good option. Or if you're someone who has an R6 II and is looking for a backup camera body, mind you, with slightly fewer features, the R8 is gonna be a great option. The only other camera that I would consider comparing it to is this guy, the Lumix S9, which I think I'm gonna do a separate video on talking about the S9 in comparison to the R8, but it is a more expensive camera. It does have in-body image stabilization. It does have bigger batteries that last longer than the R8, so we'll talk about that in a future video. And the S9 is arguably a better camera for video if you only record in small batches. But jumping back to the R6ii and the R8, last year when I was speaking for Canon at ProFusion, I had a lady come up to me and she was ready to buy a camera. And the question she asked me was R8 or R6 Mark II. I told her, well, do you have the budget for the R6 II? And she told me yes. And I said, well, go with the R6 II. And her reply back was, oh, but I like the smaller size and the smaller form factor of the R8, which again, for some people is gonna be an advantage if you're someone who travels with your camera and needs something smaller. One of the things that I found is that the R8 does fit into spaces that my R6 II normally wouldn't. Like, instead of bringing an extra lens and putting that into my camera bag, I can pretty much fit this in the same space that I would pack something like a small prime lens. But the reason that I told her R6 Mark II is because of the way the body is designed. The R8 lacks a few key functions that I really like in the R6 Mark II that are present in Canon's higher end mirrorless cameras. One is the rotary dial that you get on the back, and the little nubbin, the joystick that you can kind of use to navigate the menus or change your autofocus points. On the R8, while there is the 4-way D-pad, it's not as versatile as having both the joystick and the rotary dial. Also, there's no rate button. Sounds stupid, I know, but a lot of the time I'm going through reviewing photos in the moment, hitting rate so that when I open them later in Lightroom, my photos are already somewhat pre-sorted. And if you take a look at the top dial, you'll notice that there's also one less custom mode. It might be hard to tell at first, but the R8 does have a slightly smaller screen and electronic viewfinder. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more robust, something that's maybe gonna give you a better picture when you're out shooting in the middle of the day, or something that's just a little bit bigger so you can see it easier, the R6 II does have that advantage. To me personally, the R6 II is just more comfortable in my hands. Like, ideally, I want something that I can fit all of my fingers on. It's something that I really only get with Canon cameras, like even comparing to Sony cameras or other cameras, I always find that my pinky, like you can see with the R8, it's a little bit shorter. It just wants a place to live, and I don't get that all the time, or I kind of have to like scrunch my hand up to get my whole hand on the grip. I mentioned that the R8 doesn't have a full mechanical shutter. So if you go into the menu, you'll find that mechanical shutter isn't there as an option. What you get instead is electronic first curtain. So mechanical shutters have a first curtain and a second curtain, or a top curtain and a bottom curtain. And when you actuate it, depending on your shutter speed, the distance between those two curtains opens and closes. With the R6 II, the R5, and the higher end cameras, you get both of those curtains. But with the R8, you only get it closing with the curtain. So the first curtain, instead of being present, is electronic. So the sensor opens electronically and closes mechanically. That means the R8 is slightly more susceptible to flicker, and while the camera does have an anti-flicker mode, it doesn't work in every scenario. But there is one advantage to electronic first curtain, which is the camera will vibrate less. It means that there's nothing inside the camera that shakes prior to the exposure occurring. It's a little bit of a confusing concept to explain, but it basically means in some very rare shooting instances, the image quality with electronic first curtain will turn out better than mechanical. Now, one of the disadvantages with electronic first curtain is that it can mess up the bokeh inside your images. So the background, those blurry orbs that you get, in some very rare instances, you might notice a loss in quality. I personally didn't notice it, but something I did notice, you can see in these two images. So this is an ISO test, a high ISO test. The R8 is on the left, the R6 II is on the right. And if we zoom in, we take a look, it is really hard to notice a difference. The ISO performance at 25,600 looks the same. It's what we'd expect since both of these sensors are identical. There is gonna be some differences in the composition of this image because the sensors aren't exactly in the same place when I put them on the tripod, but you might notice in the background, there's this pattern to the noise. There's these horizontal lines. So it might be hard to see on YouTube. Maybe pause the video and see if you can notice it. And that's because we were shooting in electronic first curtain with an LED panel, which naturally causes some flicker. Now, I was using the anti-flicker detection, the same settings on both of these cameras, but if I grab the one on the right, which is our R6ii, and I switch it to the mechanical shutter, I don't know if you noticed, but the lines went away. So in mechanical shutter, you don't get that flickering, or you won't get as much flickering. In some instances with certain LED panels, you still will get flickering. But in this case, the mechanical shutter does a much better job at mitigating that lines, those like that, it's not really moire, if you want to call it moire, but it's basically the line flicker caused by LED lighting. Also, fun fact, I don't know if you noticed, but I shot those photos on the new 35mm f1.4, which I have right here. So stay tuned for a video, maybe some photos, maybe something from the 35-1.4. I don't know what yet, but it will be coming. But perhaps the biggest limitation with the R8 is the fact that it uses Canon's smaller LPE 17 batteries. They do not have as many milliamps, meaning they don't have as much juice as the larger batteries. And because I only got one sent to me with this camera to test, I was constantly having to, oh boy, I put this in wrong. Wrong way. Because I only had one sent to me with the camera, I found myself constantly having to recharge the camera, which you can do through USB-C, but if you're gonna get this camera, just do me a favor, get more batteries, because it eats a lot of juice. Orange juice, apple juice, booster juice. Also a disadvantage, the camera only has a single card slot. So with the R6ii, you flick open the side, there are 2 SD cards. With this guy, the card slot is shared with the battery, so it's right in the bottom, and you only get one. So if you're someone where redundant shooting is important, or you're shooting something super critical like weddings, or if you're getting paid to do your photography, it might be advantageous, very advantageous to get something like the R6ii. For a little bit over $1,000, the Canon R8 offers incredible value when you compare it to its much more expensive $2,000-ish bigger brother, the Canon R6ii. I know for myself, if I was to go back 10 years with my little Rebel T1i and been given the choice to upgrade to something like a 7D or the 70D at the time, which is what I was looking at, or an entry-level full-frame camera for the exact same price, I 100% would have gone with the full-frame camera. And that's the main reason why the Canon R8 is so popular. For a lot of photographers, it's gonna be the choice between this guy or something like the Canon R7, which is APS-C, it's a bigger, fuller size body, but it doesn't have that full frame juice, the oomph, maybe even just the clout of owning a full frame camera. I'll be the first to say that the R8 is easily the best value full frame camera currently on the market. I don't think any other of the camera brands come close. Over the month that I shot with the R8, I found myself grabbing it just as often as I was grabbing the R6ii and not really worrying about it. There was no fear inside me that somehow I was losing out on image quality, or that there would be something I wouldn't be able to shoot, a type of photography I wouldn't be able to shoot on the R8 that I would if I had the R6 Mark II. But more than likely, if you've watched this far in the video, you've probably already made up your mind which one is for you, or maybe you already own one or both of these cameras. Let me know down in the comments below, and until the next one, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos. I almost missed putting that on there.